the environment's a very big issue. All our students know about the environment. They learn about it in science, they read about it in newspapers, they hear about it on TV. It's a great cause for concern for many young people. It's something about which they're really passionate. But they often don't realise that the thing they're learning about in science, the thing that they are so passionate about, the thing maybe they've got an environmental studies club at school or a cycling club, what they often don't realise is that a lot of this environmentalism goes back to and originates from different faith traditions, different cultural traditions that people have that are very strong, that provide very often very different ways of coming at the whole question of the environment and the challenges that it poses for modern people. So I was wondering if we could start off maybe by you giving us a sort of brief introduction about what you think personally about the environment and how that relates to your spiritual path. So I'll throw that one open to anyone who'd like to jump in.
Thank you. Well, as a Hindu, I see the world around me, everything as God's creation. And so what it says in the Bhagavad Gita is that we should respect everything that God has created for us, and that it's there for us to use, but not to use selfishly, not to overuse it for our own personal needs. So we must respect what we're given to keep order and balance between all the creations around us. So that's something that's really important to me and something that in my personal life I can look back to in reference. And also there's the issue of karma as well, which is that every action that a Hindu takes can have a consequence to it. And then, so it's about respecting everything that's around me, because all of my actions are going to have consequences, and I don't want there to be negative consequences, and I should be grateful for what I've been given. So for me personally, it's very much about respecting what's around me, because everything that has been given to me has been given to me by God, and so it's there to be respected and to be used, to be utilised in a sensible manner, not to overuse for my own personal benefits. That's personally what I get inspired by from my own faith.
As a Muslim, I might not necessarily agree with karma as in the Hindu tradition, but I do believe in accountability and being answerable to God about how we treat His creation. So the whole world is His creation and everything in it. Animals, the trees, the skies, the water and the seas. And we have to use it responsibly. And for every drop of water from a tap to how we cut down trees and how we treat animals, I'd be answerable to God for that. So as a Muslim, I'm taught to treat this world and everything in it as a trust from God, and that I have to give it back to Him, and I have to pass it on to those coming after me as well. So it's important to kind of, as I'm using the world's resources as I do, remember to think about how I can make them sustainable and how we can pass them on to future generations. But it's really interesting to see how in my tradition it's about accountability and about being answerable for the way we use the world's resources, and in your tradition it's about that having an impact within your lifetime on you.
I'm quite interested though, because within the Hindu context, in the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna compares the world to a banyan tree, and he says because the banyan tree is so big, it encompasses a lot of creatures together, it's a big space, and Lord Krishna compares the banyan tree to the world. I'm quite interested within the Muslim faith and other faiths if there's any sort of examples like this where the world is compared to something else. To give an example.
That's a good question, you've got me thinking. Yeah.
While you're thinking of answers, someone else can pitch in on something different, and maybe we can come back to that.
I've actually just thought of a similar comparison in Judaism about explaining how the world is seen. And there's a statement that the world is seen as a very narrow bridge, because this world is sort of almost like a corridor into the next world, and all your deeds will be counted. So that's why guarding yourself is so important in this world. And in terms of how that relates to the environment, sort of like, we've been given this world, and we've been told that we should guard it and we should look after it. So whilst we're, like, as a Jew, I'm, happy to use all the resources of the world, and that's, something that we should celebrate. We shouldn't like hide away from what we've been given. But at the same time, it's about being sensible and about being, like you said, accountable, and making sure that you're leaving something for the future generations. And there's also a concept of like not wasting. So wherever you can, just to make sure that you're not using too much of anything or being too, like, I guess, gluttonous in any way, and just using what you need and making sure that you're just keeping things like in balance.
For me, it's like it's not so much like karma or accountability as responsibility, and I think not only to the earth, because I get a lot of spiritual value from nature, but because of the impacts that climate change has on humanity, and I feel that everybody who is a human is responsible for other humans and for their well-being. There's a Quaker tradition of seeing that of God in everyone, and therefore if someone is suffering because of my action, even if that's inadvertently, in the West we know that it's really our actions that are impacting global warming, and that's really affecting the world's poorest people. So I don't feel like I'm accountable to God, but I feel more I'm accountable to them. If my actions are impacting negatively on the world and on the world's people, I need to think about that. And there's also, in the Quaker tradition, there is the testimony to simplicity. So it is really about thinking about how you live and whether you are using in excess of what you need. And just, simplicity is not just about the resources you live, it's also about the way you live your life. But I think it's really important, because I think sometimes we can just get cluttered, and it's just been Christmas and people are like, oh, what do you want for Christmas? Actually, I couldn't come up with hardly anything that I really needed, and then you go down Oxford Street and people are just buying things because it costs £5 even though they didn't really need a new t-shirt. And I think we can all be a bit guilty of that every so often,
I think that's so interesting what you said about kind of accountability and responsibility to each other, as well as, or perhaps instead of a new tradition, instead of to something divine. I think something that strikes me sometimes in my Christian tradition is almost a slight, maybe not contradiction or paradox, but a slight difficulty between, on the one hand, I remember growing up with a very strong sense of this notion of stewardship. If you'd asked me, I think even when I was quite young in primary school, if you'd said, how should you as a Christian, or how should you as a person, as a young person, as a British person, as a whatever person, how should you look after the environment, I would use this word stewardship. This idea, similar to, I think, to what you were talking about as one of kind of responsibility, and Kat, I think you mentioned kind of thinking about future generations as well. But I think I see a slight contradiction within, perhaps within readings of my Christian faith, with this idea of stewardship versus this idea of dominion, this idea of humans being in charge of, or being above, or being on top of other creatures, other living things in some kind of hierarchy. And it's interesting because a couple of years ago, following a conversation with a very good friend of mine who's Buddhist, and as well as other things, other reasons, I decided to become vegetarian. And when people would ask me, sometimes they say, "Oh, is it a religious thing? Is it a spiritual thing?" I say, "Well, yeah, actually, it is, because I'm, as a Christian, I think I see this responsibility in this way, and I'm trying to be mindful of my consumption, and I'm trying to feel more connected to the place I live and the people and the things amongst which I live." But then they would say, "Well, that's cool, but what about that bit in Genesis where God says, I've made the animals for you, like Adam, all this stuff is for you. You can name it, you can do with it what you want." And sometimes people would say to me, "Oh, so Sean, you think it's wrong to eat animals? Was Jesus wrong because he ate a lamb on the Sabbath?" As if it was some kind of could kind of score points off me, or could kind of use my scripture against me to convince me that my vegetarianism is wrong, but I just think that's so interesting because those ideas are so intertwined. I think it reminds me of how easy it is, for me, I read that scripture and I think like responsibility and stewardship and safeguarding and like connectedness and mindfulness. But someone from my own tradition, someone from my own church, someone in my family, the rest of my family aren't vegetarian, could read that scripture and think, yeah, that's cool, we should safeguard it, we should look after it, but it's fine for me to eat it. Like, it's fine for me to to rely on these resources or to use more than my fair share, because that's kind of what God has given to me. So I think for me, I've always been really conscious of this tension almost between that idea of stewardship and that idea of being mindful and being kind of simple and being connected to the things around me.
I think that reminds me how you're talking about how humans aren't necessarily above other creations. That the Quran says that God says in the Quran that we've honoured the children of Adam, i.e. we've honoured human beings, and we've given him that status. When I read that, I understand that as being that God has given us the ability to reason, to think rationally, and to think carefully about how we treat the rest of His creation. And so it's interesting thinking about how we have to be mindful of not overestimating ourselves, not putting ourselves above the rest of God's creation, but about how we can use God's creation in the world, whatever that might be, to the best of our ability, but to safeguard it and steward it in some ways for those coming after us as well.
I think something else that I've been thinking about recently is this idea almost of where those values for myself come from. Because I think if you ask me kind of generally, Sean, where do your values come from, where do your morals come from, I would say, immediately I'd say it's from my faith. I'm a Christian, I'm a Catholic, it's from scripture, it's from the church, it's from whatever. But thinking about it, I go to church every Sunday, and I don't think I've ever heard, maybe once in those 23 years, I've heard a sermon, I've heard someone preaching about the importance of protecting the environment, the importance of stewardship in a really meaningful way that isn't just, it's really important that we protect it, therefore we should recycle our cans, as if recycling our cans was kind of, it might be necessary, but I would argue that it's not necessarily sufficient to, doing our duty as individuals, as Christians. And I think it's kind of coming back to I guess what I was saying before, but that idea of, when I read my scripture, I see so much, to speak slightly more broadly, I see so much about justice and equality and fairness and standing up for the rights of the poor and the oppressed. I've read similar ideas, similar concepts in other traditions as well. But it's just so interesting the way that certain things, get focused on again in my own scripture in the Bible, and certain things tend to get slightly kind of glossed over. And for me, I read the Gospels particularly, and I don't really see how someone could read the Gospels, could read the stories that Jesus told, and not be utterly convinced of the need to be more connected and to always try and be more connected with both the people and the things, the places around them. But it's really interesting to think about that from myself, because I do have this religious upbringing. I've been brought up in quite a strong Christian family, and so there is kind of that influence. But at the same time, like I say, I'm really conscious that actually the number of times I've heard my priest or other preachers kind of talking about these things is probably not many.
I don't know about everyone else, but I feel personally, I don't feel closer to God than when I am actually in the outdoors. And I think it's because I am through and through a city girl. But as my faith has got stronger, I'm appreciating God's creations more. And I find before the thought of going out for a walk or something, or a hike or something, I think, oh my goodness, no way. But now I feel like I need those environments for me to actually connect more. I feel over here, living in a city, I've got my bubble, I've got my routine, and if I do my prayers, it's almost like it can become a bit routine. But I think taking the time out to be kind of like at one with nature, it gives you a whole different perspective. Personally, for me, that's what I feel. I'm not sure how that relates with how you feel as well, but that's something that I've come to appreciate nature more as I've grown stronger in my personal faith.